If you ever found yourself standing at the edge of everything you'd lost, you might understand how Jack Miller felt that gray September afternoon, his 10-year-old daughter's small hand pressed into his palm. The road to Bend, Oregon, unspooled like a ribbon frayed at the edges, winding past shuttered mills and sunburned fields, all the way to the old Hayes family farm that had haunted Jack's memories since childhood. The truck's engine coughed and rattled as he steered it off the highway, tires crunching over gravel. The farmhouse and weather-beaten barn huddled against the distant pine ridges, half swallowed by shadow and late summer dust. Jack's hands still shook as he killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring out at the faded red barn door, its hinges buckled with rust, its boards slanted as if tired from holding up so many secrets. He'd told Emily stories about this place, how her great-grandfather, Thomas Hayes, had built the barn himself, hammering every nail by lantern light. Now, standing here with a duffel bag in one hand and Emily's backpack in the other, Jack wasn't sure what to expect. He only knew they had nowhere else to go. The eviction notice in Portland had been swift and final. 3 days to pack up their lives and vanish before the next family moved in. Emily stepped from the cab, blinking in the autumn light. She tried to hide her fear, clutching her battered stuffed rabbit close to her chest. But Jack caught the way she glanced at the wind-blown fields, the hollow windows, the faded Hayes Farm sign that creaked in the breeze. "This was Grandpa's house?" she asked, almost whispering, as if afraid to disturb something old and watchful. Jack nodded, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Yeah, and now it's ours, at least for a while." He led her up the broken flagstone path, through a tangle of wild rose bushes and brambles that had claimed the yard. The house itself stood silent, its porch sagging under the weight of years. But the barn felt alive somehow, drawing Jack's attention with a prickle of unease. He needed to check it, see if the old tools or generator were still there. Maybe even a can of gas for the wood stove inside. He slid open the barn door, the wood groaning in protest. The dimness inside pressed close, thick with the scent of hay, old oil, and something deeper, a musky tang that brought the hair up on Jack's arms. Sunlight lanced through gaps in the walls, casting stripes across the packed dirt floor and revealing mountains of dust swirling in the stillness. Jack stepped forward, boots sinking into a drift of straw. That's when he saw them. A pair of golden eyes, wide and unblinking, staring at him from the shadows beyond the tractor's skeletal frame. For a long, heartbeat-suspended moment, Jack froze. His mind registered the impossible size, the taut, sleek lines of muscle, the twitch of tufted ears. A bobcat, huge, powerful, its coat dusted with tawny and charcoal stripes, paws as broad as Jack's fists. It stood perfectly still, only the ripple of its whiskers betraying its presence. Jack's hand slid instinctively to his belt, searching for the folding knife he'd used in Afghanistan. He remembered the stories. Wildcats were rare, dangerous if cornered, unpredictable. But something in the animal's gaze held him rooted. It was not fear nor malice, but a challenge. A question, perhaps, about who belonged here now. Emily's voice broke the silence, soft but urgent from the doorway behind him. "Daddy, what's in there?" Jack held up a hand, never looking away from the animal. He fought the urge to shout or throw something. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay outside, Em. There's a wild animal. Don't move." The bobcat's golden eyes narrowed, its tail flicking once, twice. For a tense, timeless stretch, Jack and the animal regarded each other, each measuring the other's intent. Jack could almost feel the weight of the past pressing in. The family stories, the desperate hope that this place could be a new beginning. He couldn't afford another fight. Not here. Not now. Slowly, he backed toward the door, never breaking eye contact. The bobcat watched, every muscle coiled, but did not move. Only when Jack and Emily had retreated outside did it slink into deeper shadow, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. Jack pulled the barn door shut, chest pounding. For a moment, the world was nothing but the rush of blood in his ears. Emily looked up at him, wide-eyed and pale. "What was it, Daddy?" Jack swallowed, managing a shaky smile. "Just a neighbor. Looks like we're not alone out here." As dusk fell over the farm, Jack tried to shake the feeling of those golden eyes following him. That night, after tucking Emily into a sleeping bag in the half-furnished living room, he sat by the window, watching shadows slip across the yard. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep. Every whisper of wind seemed charged with meaning. He thought of the empty fridge, the dwindling cash in his pocket, the way the world kept closing in. Yet, as the moon rose over the fields, Jack felt something shift inside him. A stubborn defiance, maybe, or a reminder that even in the darkest places, there could be a spark of wild hope. Long after Emily drifted to sleep, Jack returned to the barn, flashlight in hand. He found no sign of the bobcat, just a faint, musky scent lingering near the tractor and a set of fresh paw prints pressed into the dust. He knelt and touched one, larger than any domestic cat, impossibly real. Maybe it was foolish to hope for a sign. But standing there in the cold, Jack felt a strange sense of kinship, as if the wildcat was not just a threat, but a guardian. Maybe, just maybe, they both needed this place to start again. He closed the barn door and locked it, whispering a promise to the night. "We'll find a way. One way or another, we'll survive." Somewhere in the darkness, golden eyes blinked, watching, waiting. And so began the uneasy truce that would change everything. The morning after their arrival, the world felt sharpened by the chill of early fall. Jack rose before dawn, the familiar aches in his back and shoulders reminding him of years spent in less forgiving places. He looked at his sleeping daughter, her breath slow and even beneath a quilted blanket, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe they might be safe here. But the memory of the bobcat's golden eyes still flickered at the edges of his thoughts, mingling with the relentless questions about the future. By the time sunlight crawled across the porch, Jack was already outside, his boots crunching frost on the flagstones. He scanned the overgrown yard for any sign of the animal, but nothing moved except a flock of startled crows taking flight from the hayfield. Still, he checked the barn, heart hammering in his chest, ready for a confrontation he hoped to avoid. The barn stood silent, the air inside thick with dust and possibility. Only a few fresh paw prints near the doorway marked the bobcat's passing. No threat, just a presence. Jack's instincts warred between caution and awe. He knew wild animals could be dangerous, but there was a part of him, long dulled by city life, that respected the creature's right to exist. He found Emily standing at the kitchen window, peering out with a mix of fear and wonder. Over breakfast, stale bread and canned beans, she asked if the wildcat would come back. Jack told her the truth. It probably would, but they would be careful and stay out of its way. He decided firmly and finally not to harm the animal. There had been enough violence in his life. This time, he would choose something different. That choice set the day in motion. With a crowbar and an old flashlight, Jack returned to the barn. He began cleaning, tossing aside rotted hay and splintered crates, his breath hanging in the cool air. Every movement sent clouds of dust swirling, sunlight catching the particles like flecks of gold. Deep in the clutter, behind rusted tools and a toppled wheelbarrow, he found an old wooden chest bound with iron straps. Its lock had long since rusted through. Jack knelt, pried it open, and was greeted by the musty scent of oil and age. Inside, carefully wrapped in faded linen, were journals and a rolled set of blueprints marked in careful script. Thomas Hayes, 1967. Jack's hands trembled as he leafed through the pages, the looping handwriting spelling out designs for something astonishing. A small drone, sketched in detail with notations about humanitarian aid, emergency supply drops, medical delivery routes. Mixed among the technical notes were entries in Thomas's hand, recounting failures and breakthroughs, and dreams of a machine that could save lives in places too dangerous for men. As he read, Emily's curiosity got the better of her. She slipped into the barn, eyes wide, and asked what he'd found. Jack, moved by her enthusiasm, showed her a simplified page, a drawing of a flying machine carrying a box of medicine to a snowbound town. Emily's imagination caught fire. She peppered him with questions, wondering if great-grandpa's invention ever worked, if it could help people now. Later that afternoon, as Jack repaired a broken fence post, Emily wandered to the neighbor's place, a weathered house just visible beyond the hedgerow. There, she met Mrs. Lawson, an elderly woman who lived alone, and in her innocent, eager way, Emily mentioned that her great-grandfather had once built a strange flying machine in the barn. Mrs. Lawson smiled at the child's tale, but that evening, over tea, she recounted it to her son, a man named Doug, who happened to work for Vance Corporation, a giant in local construction and development. The news traveled fast, as things often do in small towns. By dusk, a single phone call reached Arthur Vance himself, Emily's grandfather and the man who, years ago, had wrested the farm and its secrets away from the Hayes family. Vance was no stranger to ruthless ambition. The mention of a flying machine on the old property lit a fire of suspicion and greed. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by blueprints and journals, trying to make sense of the inheritance that had landed, unasked, in his lap. He thought about the animal outside, about Emily's bright hope, and the growing sense that their quiet exile was over. By choosing to keep the drone, Jack realized, he'd cracked open an old feud, one with roots deep in the family and the land itself. As he drifted towards sleep, Jack heard a faint sound beyond the walls, a gentle thump on the porch. He rose quietly, careful not to wake Emily, and eased open the door. There, in the pale wash of moonlight, he saw the Bobcat again, silent and majestic, eyes glowing with a wild light. For a long moment, animal and man regarded each other, and Jack sensed something shift, a wordless understanding, a fragile peace that would bind their fates in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Unbeknownst to him, other eyes were watching the farm now, hungry for secrets and old grievances. But inside, Jack finally allowed himself a breath of hope, not just for survival, but for something better. The night seemed less empty, as if the wild was offering its own kind of promise. In the days that followed, a strange rhythm settled over the battered old farm. Jack set to work restoring whatever he could, patching leaks, clearing fallen branches, and salvaging supplies from sheds half swallowed by brambles. The ache in his body was a familiar companion, but it was steadied now by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his world fell apart. He rarely let Emily out of his sight, yet she seemed to thrive in the wild spaces, her fears softened by the routines they carved out together. Every evening, she would help him gather kindling or sweep out the dust that never seemed to end. It wasn't peace exactly. There was too much uncertainty for that. But it was as close as Jack and Emily had been to something like safety in months. Each night, as the sun slipped behind the distant Cascade foothills, Jack sat by the window, looking out at the dark fields, listening for sounds that didn't belong. He kept the journals and blueprints close, hidden in a lockbox beneath a loose floorboard. Every so often, he would pore over their contents late into the night, tracing the careful diagrams and deciphering Thomas Hayes's words, searching for clues about what his great-grandfather had truly left behind. The Bobcat, too, became a part of their uneasy routine. Emily had started calling him Whisper, for the way he seemed to appear and vanish on silent paws, barely more than a shimmer of tawny shadow at the edges of their days. Jack never encouraged it, but he didn't forbid it either. Something about the animal's calm, almost regal presence unsettled and reassured him at the same time. Whisper never came close enough to touch, but his presence was unmistakable. Some mornings, Jack found rabbit fur or the remains of a squirrel left on the porch. A wild offering, whether as a warning or a gift. Jack wasn't sure. He kept the barn doors secured and made certain Emily understood the rules. Never approach, never feed, never try to follow the bobcat if he disappeared into the woods. Still, the animal seemed to accept their presence. And as word spread among the local deer and coyotes that a new apex predator had claimed the old Hayes place, Jack noticed fewer scavengers raiding the garden, fewer rats nesting in the hayloft. Despite the gradual sense of belonging, Jack's unease never fully faded. He knew the rumor of the flying machine had already escaped the farm's boundaries. The neighbor, Mrs. Lawson, would sometimes wave as she passed, her expression tinged with something like curiosity and pity. Jack wondered what stories she had told her son, and what those stories had become by the time they reached the ears of Arthur Vance. Jack tried to keep a low profile. He kept Emily close, avoided unnecessary trips to town, and ignored the occasional strange car idling at the edge of the road. He convinced himself that the best way to keep the past buried was to remain invisible. But there were always reminders that the outside world hadn't forgotten them. One evening, as a storm brewed in the west, Jack sat reading by the fireplace while Emily sketched at the kitchen table. Thunder rumbled over the hills, and the wind rattled the window panes. The isolation felt heavier than usual, weighted by the sense that someone, was watching them from the darkening fields. Whisper had not been seen that day, and the silence outside was oppressive. Just after midnight, Jack woke suddenly, senses on high alert. At first, he heard only the wind, but then, through the restless hush of the storm, came a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, rising and falling with the gusts. He eased out of bed, careful not to disturb Emily, and crept to the window. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard in a split-second burst of blue-white. Jack saw movement near the barn, a pair of figures slipping along the fence line, hunched and purposeful. He held his breath as a shadow detached itself from the darkness, padding forward with predatory intent. Whisper. The bobcat, larger than life in the storm-lit night, moved with fluid grace, his golden eyes catching the light. Jack watched as the bobcat circled the intruders, a silent threat in the wild. One man swore, loud enough for Jack to hear even through the closed window, and both retreated quickly, melting into the woods. Whisper remained for a moment, tail lashing, before turning and vanishing into the deeper dark. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as the rain began to fall in earnest. He stood by the window for a long time, barely breathing, trying to piece together what he had seen. He knew then that the bobcat was more than just a wild neighbor. He was a protector, in some strange and dangerous way. Yet the danger was growing too. Someone was coming for what lay hidden on the farm, and whisper alone might not be enough to stop them. When dawn came, Jack searched the yard for any trace of the night's events. He found fresh prints in the mud, booted feet coming and going, and the wide, unmistakable paw marks of the bobcat. Jack knew the illusion of safety had shattered. The storm had only been a warning. The real threat was closing in, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. In the uneasy days that followed the storm, Jack's nerves never fully settled. He moved through each morning with a constant, low-level tension coiled in his muscles. As the sun rose over the fields, illuminating dew on the tall grass, and sending fractured light through the warped glass of the kitchen window, he made a quiet promise to himself. This time, he wouldn't let his guard down. He started with the fences. Long before Emily woke, Jack scoured the property line, hammering in new posts and tightening sagging wires. He worked silently, head down, every sense alert for movement at the edges of his vision. The memory of those midnight trespassers clung to him, a shadow that seemed to lengthen each time a crow cried from the old maple or the wind rattled a loose board. He found footprints near the back gate, half erased by the rain, and broken branches that hadn't been there the day before. He reinforced the barn doors, adding a padlock, and dragged heavy cinder blocks in front of the side entrance. Every action made the place look less like a home and more like a fortress, but Jack had learned long ago that vigilance was better than regret. Inside the house, the air felt heavy with secrets. Emily sensed the change, though Jack tried to shield her from his worry. She grew quieter, spending more time watching from the windows, sometimes asking about Whisper, sometimes just drawing endless loops and shadows in her notebook. Jack reassured her with gentle words, but he knew she could see the tension in his jaw and the way he checked every latch twice before bed. At the same time, the old journals and blueprints weighed on Jack's mind. He spent long nights hunched over them at the kitchen table, tracing the faded lines with his finger, searching for details he might have missed. His great-grandfather's careful script seemed to speak directly to him across the decades. Notes about radio frequencies, prototype parts, and one page that hinted at a patent never filed. Jack began to realize just how much was at stake. If the wrong people discovered what was hidden here, everything could be lost. Not just for him and Emily, but for the memory of Thomas Hayes and the idea he died defending. The tension on the farm seeped into the community. Neighbors who once waved became more distant, their curiosity now sharpened by suspicion. The story of the stolen flying machine spread in quiet whispers. Jack could feel the stares at the grocery store, sense the shift in the air when he passed through town. He caught wind of rumors that Arthur Vance himself had put out feelers, asking pointed questions about the old Hayes place and its new occupants. It didn't help that Jack was an outsider, a city man with a past most folks only guessed at. At dusk, Jack walked the property with a flashlight, watching shadows lengthen over the fields. It was on one of these patrols that he glimpsed movement by the tree line. Too small to be a person, but not a deer or raccoon. For a moment, golden eyes flashed in the half-light, then vanished. Jack's heart lifted briefly. Whisper was still out there, patrolling his territory, keeping silent watch over the fragile boundary between wild and human. But even Whisper's presence couldn't prevent what happened next. One evening, As Emily sat curled by the window, she caught sight of a figure darting through the tall grass near the barn. Jack rushed outside in time to see the bobcat, muscles rippling, fur bristling, give chase to the intruder. In the confusion, the stranger stumbled, lost a shoe, and bolted toward the road, Whisper hot on his heels. Jack saw the flash of panic on the man's face before he disappeared into the trees, the bobcat slipping after him like a shadow. The adrenaline took hours to subside. Jack returned inside to find Emily staring wide-eyed, her knuckles white around her sketchbook. He tried to comfort her, but the truth was written across both their faces. Their fragile peace had shattered. The line between safety and danger was growing thinner by the day. That night, after Emily had finally drifted to sleep, Jack sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the quiet tick of the old clock. Whisper had returned, leaving muddy prints on the porch and a feather from some unlucky bird. Jack stared at those prints, pondering the unlikely alliance that was forming, man and wildcat thrown together by circumstance, both fighting for a home that seemed determined to slip away. He knew, deep down, that his actions, locking down the barn, hiding the prototype, reinforcing the boundaries, were only drawing more attention. The harder he tried to protect what mattered, the more fiercely the outside world seemed to push back. He wondered if he was making things worse, if his instinct for defense would cost him everything. Yet, as the night deepened and the woods outside grew still, Jack also felt a flicker of defiance. He refused to be driven away again, not by men with greedy eyes, not by ghosts of the past. Somewhere in the darkness, Whisper slipped back into the trees, leaving only paw prints glistening in the dew. Jack stood on the porch, staring into the wild night, and asked himself the question he knew would haunt him until the end. Could a wild bobcat really be protecting his family? If you were in Jack's place, would you believe it? Or would you be ready for a fight that might change everything? By the time the first leaves began to curl and tumble from the maple in front of the farmhouse, the uneasy truce Jack had maintained with the outside world collapsed. There was no longer any illusion of safety. Vance Corporation made its move, not with brute force, but with papers, process servers, and the cold machinery of law. It started with a letter, hand-delivered by a man in a gray suit who left his car running at the end of the drive. The envelope was thick, the pages inside heavy with legalese and veiled threats. Jack barely understood the full scope, but the words property dispute, unlawful possession, and custody review rang through his head like an alarm. Vance wasn't just coming for the barn or the blueprints. He was coming for Emily, too. Jack sat at the scarred kitchen table long after the sun had set, reading the documents again and again, searching for some way out. Each page seemed to tighten the noose. Demands for the return of all property belonging to Vance Corp., accusations that Jack was illegally occupying the farm, and a petition for emergency custody, arguing that the environment was dangerous and unstable for a child. There was even a signed affidavit, sworn by a local who'd seen a wild bobcat on the property, claiming Emily's welfare was at risk. In that moment, Jack's anger burned away the last remnants of hope that Vance would ever play fair. Jack knew he could no longer afford to just defend, reinforce, or hide. The game had changed. If he kept playing by the old rules, he would lose everything: his daughter, his last connection to Thomas Hayes, the dream of finishing what his great-grandfather started. Defense alone would cost too much. He would have to fight back, not just to survive, but to prove the truth that Vance had tried to erase for decades. That night, the farm was tense and still. Jack walked the property in silence, flashlight in hand, checking the locks, his mind racing with strategies. Every noise seemed sharper, every shadow deeper. Whisper made no appearance. The woods felt emptier without the Bobcat's silent patrol. Jack felt the absence keenly, a sense that even the wild had withdrawn in the face of legal threats and human cruelty. He returned to the kitchen, spread out the journals, blueprints, and every letter he could find from Thomas Hayes. He knew there had to be something, a signature, a note, a contract, that proved the invention had always belonged to the Hayes family. Hours slipped by as he searched through brittle pages, his fingers smudged with dust and ink, his heart thudding with urgency. Some pages referenced the original agreement, a partnership formed in the hopeful early days between Thomas Hayes and Arthur Vance, long before ambition and betrayal poisoned everything. The rain returned, drumming steadily on the tin roof, a slow, relentless rhythm that mirrored Jack's resolve. He knew Vance would do anything to keep the truth hidden. The custody petition was a weapon as sharp and cruel as any blade. Jack saw, in vivid flashes, what losing this fight would mean. Emily lost to the system, or worse, to the cold world of Vance's empire, the farm gutted and stripped, Whisper's wild realm bulldozed to make way for concrete and profit. It was Emily who, quietly and without complaint, forced Jack to find the courage to fight. She never asked about the legal papers, but she saw the lines etched deeper into her father's face. She worked beside him without protest, her laughter rarer, her eyes always seeking the tree line for a glimpse of her wild companion. At night, when she slept, Jack watched over her, the weight of everything they stood to lose pressing down on his chest. By the end of the week, Jack made his decision. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't let Vance dictate the story or rewrite history. He'd find the proof, expose the theft, and reclaim both the invention and their future. The first step would be to find legal help, someone who knew the ins and outs of property law, someone unafraid to take on Arthur Vance. Jack made a list of names, circled the number for Sarah Reed, a lawyer known for championing underdogs, and prepared to call as soon as the sun rose. But as he extinguished the lamp and stood at the window, Jack caught movement at the edge of the yard. Not Whisper this time, but the gleam of headlights from a car parked just out of sight, engine idling, watching. Jack stared back, unblinking, refusing to show fear. If Vance wanted a war, he'd chosen the wrong man to push too far. The storm inside Jack was silent but absolute. He would not give up. Not the farm, not the invention, and above all, not Emily. The time for hiding was over. The fight had begun. By the first snow, the farm had taken on a tense, electric hush. Each morning, the world outside was wrapped in a thin white blanket, muffling the sounds of passing cars and distant chainsaws as autumn faded fully into winter. Jack's routines became more urgent and methodical, stoking the wood stove before dawn, double-checking every lock, scanning the fence lines for footprints that did not belong to animals. True to his word, Jack made the call to Sarah Reed. Her reputation for taking on powerful men and winning had traveled ahead of her, and her arrival at the farm brought a flicker of hope. Sarah was brisk, sharp-eyed, and direct, wasting no time on pleasantries. She sifted through the pile of journals, blueprints, and faded legal documents, her fingers moving with an energy that matched Jack's mounting desperation. She explained what would be needed: a clear link between Thomas Hayes and the original patent, evidence that Arthur Vance had fraudulently claimed the invention as his own, and proof that Jack and Emily were rightful heirs. For days, Jack and Sarah worked side by side at the battered kitchen table, piecing together the fractured family history. The journals offered breadcrumbs, references to agreements, partnership letters, a photograph of Thomas Hayes and a younger Vance standing together, hopeful and unbroken by the coming storm. Sarah grew increasingly convinced that the key was buried somewhere among the pages, if only they could find it before Vance's lawyers forced them out. The pressure mounted when Jack discovered the signs of a fresh intrusion. The back porch door, usually secured, hung slightly ajar one morning, and muddy prints tracked across the linoleum. Jack's gut tightened. He swept through the house, checking closets and drawers. It was Emily, sitting on her bed, who found the small black device wedged behind the bookshelf, a listening device, blinking with a sinister red light. Someone had been inside their home, planting it while they slept. Rage and dread mingled in Jack's veins, but Sarah insisted they stay calm. She gathered the device in a Ziploc bag and tucked it with the rest of their mounting evidence. They called the local sheriff, who took a statement but offered little hope. Bend had changed, he said, and men with deep pockets could make a lot of trouble disappear. That night, the wind howled through the trees and sleet hammered the tin roof. Emily, sensing the new tension, curled close to Jack as they read by lamplight. He tried to keep his voice steady, but his mind ran over contingency plans. How quickly could he get Emily out if things turned dangerous? Where would they go? Who could they trust? The farm was no longer simply a refuge. It was a battlefield. The first real blow came 2 nights later. Jack awoke to the distant sound of a struggle, low snarls, a crash, frantic scuffling outside. He raced to the window in time to see a shadow bolting through the snow, a second figure loping behind. Whisper, unmistakable even in the dim light, his fur bristling with wild fury. A glint of metal flashed as the stranger stumbled, falling to one knee. Whisper lunged, teeth bared, and the man shrieked, swinging a crowbar blindly. The Bobcat managed to drive the intruder away, but not before suffering a glancing blow to the shoulder. Jack watched in horror as Whisper limped away, his prints staining the snow with dark drops. Dawn brought silence and an uneasy peace. Jack followed the trail into the woods, heart heavy. He found Whisper curled beneath a stand of furs, eyes dulled, blood soaking his side. For a moment, Jack knelt in the snow, helpless, murmuring words of comfort the Bobcat could not understand. He left food and water before retreating, forced to trust that Whisper's wild resilience would see him through. Inside, Sarah pulled the shades and barricaded the doors. She and Jack doubled down on their efforts, combing through every journal, photograph, and contract in search of the missing proof. With each passing hour, the weight of the coming legal battle pressed heavier. Tomorrow, they would have to face Vance in court, armed with whatever they could find. That evening, as fat flakes of snow drifted past the kitchen window, Jack sat surrounded by documents, his hands shaking with exhaustion. Emily drew pictures of Whisper, her eyes worried but stubbornly hopeful. The house felt like a war room, every corner charged with the urgency of a fight they could not afford to lose. Outside, the storm raged on. Whisper lay still beneath the trees, his breath steaming in the cold, his wound still seeping. Jack's thoughts spun, of family, of legacy, of the thin thread that kept Emily safe. The next day, everything would be on the line. The invention, the farm, even the right to call himself Emily's father. He stared into the darkness, knowing that in the end, courage and truth were all he had left. If you were in Jack's place, with everything at stake and only one shot left, what would you do? Snow crunched under Jack's boots as he walked Emily to the courthouse steps. The town of Bend seemed wrapped in hush, as if it too was holding its breath. Across the street, Arthur Vance's black sedan gleamed, flanked by lawyers in sharp suits, all of them moving with predatory confidence. Jack gripped Emily's hand a little tighter, determined not to let her see his fear. Sarah Reed joined them at the doors, her portfolio stuffed with documents and hope. Today, it was all or nothing. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with low voices and the scrape of chairs. Jack felt the stares of strangers and the cool, appraising look from Vance himself, a man who never showed nerves, only hunger. Emily sat quietly at his side, sketchbook clutched in her lap, her eyes tracking every movement, every shadow cast by the morning light. The case began with the usual formalities, each word echoing too loud in the small chamber. Vance's lawyers led with precision, arguing that Jack was an unfit parent, the property uninhabitable, and that any claim to Thomas Hayes's invention was fraudulent at best. Jack's jaw clenched as he listened, but he refused to break. Sarah stood to respond, her voice unwavering as she presented their evidence. Blueprints in Thomas's hand, photographs, the battered journals, and at last, a faded letter that confirmed the original partnership had been meant as equals. Jack was called to testify first. He spoke of Thomas Hayes, the dreams that brought him to Oregon, the way the invention had been stolen through deceit and pressure. He told of coming home, not just for a fresh start, but to defend a legacy meant to help, not harm. Jack's voice caught only once, describing the threats and the shadow that Vance's power cast over every part of their lives. Sarah's questioning was sharp but never cruel. She drew out the story of the invention, how it was designed for aid, how it was never meant to fall into the hands of the highest bidder. She handed over the contracts and letters that, together, painted a picture of betrayal so clear that even the judge paused to study the documents with new attention. Then came the crucial moment, the cross-examination of a key witness, a former assistant of Thomas Hayes, now old and frail, but with a mind still sharp as a tack. He described watching Vance manipulate signatures, rewrite contracts, and isolate Thomas as his health failed. His testimony landed like thunder in the silent room, exposing the heart of the theft. Vance's lawyers protested, tried to twist his words, but the damage was done. A truth decades buried had been dragged into the light. As the morning stretched on, Emily was called to the stand. Jack's heart pounded as he watched her climb the steps, small and determined, cheeks flushed, but eyes unblinking. The lawyer asked about her time on the farm, about the Bobcat, about her father's care. Emily spoke softly, but her words painted a vivid world, of whisper appearing in the night, chasing away bad men, leaving gifts on the porch, standing guard when no one else could. She talked of fear, but also of trust, and how her father taught her to respect both the wild and the wounded. The judge listened, eyes softened by something almost like empathy. As Emily stepped down, she glanced out the window, where, through the curtain of snow, she spotted a solitary figure on the distant ridge. Whisper stood tall, fur silvered by frost, golden eyes fixed on the courthouse as if offering silent support. Emily straightened her back, her courage blooming anew. Sarah delivered her closing argument with the quiet force of conviction, painting Jack not as a thief, but as a man fighting for family, for truth, for the possibility that old wounds might finally heal. She spoke of the cost of greed, the price of silence, and the wild hope that the court might choose to do what was right. not simply what was easy. The final moments were thick with anticipation. The judge, weighing every scrap of evidence, every voice, finally delivered the verdict. The contract Vance had relied upon was found to be forged. The journals, photographs, and witness testimony had proved the invention truly belonged to the Hayes line. Jack would keep both the farm and Emily. Vance, stone-faced and rigid, stood powerless as the gavel fell. Relief surged through Jack, sharp, overwhelming, nearly blinding in its intensity. Emily wept into his arms as Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her own eyes wet with victory. The years of fear and fighting had finally tipped toward justice. Beyond the window, Whisper watched a moment longer, then melted back into the forest, his presence a reminder of everything wild and good that could never be tamed. The courthouse emptied slowly, but Jack lingered a moment, silent, knowing this victory was both an ending and a beginning. When the snow finally stopped and the courthouse emptied, Jack felt an exhaustion deeper than anything he'd ever known. The fight was over, at least in the eyes of the law, but the echoes of battle lingered everywhere, in the ache of his bones, in Emily's quiet glances, and in the hollow silence that seemed to follow them back to the farm. The legal victory felt almost unreal. The relief was heavy, not joyful. Bend, Oregon, appeared unchanged on the surface, yet for Jack, nothing would ever be quite the same. The days that followed blurred into one another. Paperwork accumulated in uneven stacks on the kitchen table. Court orders, deeds, settlement documents, the formal declaration that Jack Miller and Emily Hayes were the rightful owners of both the farm and the invention. There was a cash settlement, too, a number so large it made Jack dizzy. But money felt meaningless after so much fear and uncertainty. He focused on practical things, restoring the barn's doors, fixing fence posts that had been battered during those tense nights, repairing what he could in hopes of putting the world back together. Yet the cost of victory became clear almost immediately. Whisper, the bobcat who had become their silent guardian, had vanished. At first, Jack and Emily told themselves he was simply avoiding the noise and bustle of strangers. After all, workmen arrived to fix the roof, lawyers dropped by to sign documents, and the air was full of new voices and footsteps. But as the weeks passed, the wild corners of the property grew quiet. No prints marked the frosted grass. No small prey appeared on the porch. The woods seemed emptier, as if some vital spirit had been withdrawn. Emily searched for him every morning, her boots crunching over the brittle earth. She checked the place beneath the firs where she'd once glimpsed his gold-green eyes. She left food at the edge of the field, whispered his name into the wind. But Whisper did not return. Jack watched his daughter's determination turn slowly to sorrow, and all his victories in court felt hollow compared to this loss. He knew, deep down, that this was the price for crossing worlds that were never meant to fully meet. Whisper had always belonged to the wild, and by defending their human home, he had paid a cost that Jack could never repay. The prints leading into the deep woods grew fainter with each new dusting of snow, and eventually, there were none at all. The settlement money brought a different kind of attention. People in Bend began to treat Jack with cautious respect, their previous suspicions replaced by a blend of curiosity and envy. Some called to offer congratulations. Others came with business proposals or requests for donations. Jack met each conversation with polite distance. He cared only about the farm, the invention, and his daughter's fragile happiness. The house grew quieter. Without the constant threat from Vance and his men, Jack found himself missing the adrenaline, the sense of purpose that danger had brought. Now, He threw himself into restoring the barn and assembling the first prototypes of the humanitarian drone, piecing together Thomas Hayes's vision from the tangle of blueprints and hand-sketched diagrams. The work was difficult and absorbing, but it was not enough to fill the space left by Whisper's disappearance. Emily struggled to adjust. She attended school for the first time in months, her silence mistaken by teachers for shyness. Other children didn't quite know what to make of the girl who spoke of wildcats in courtrooms, who flinched at the slamming of lockers, whose eyes always seemed fixed on something distant. Jack did his best to reassure her, telling stories about the Bobcat, about bravery and freedom, about the unspoken promise that they would never try to tame what should remain wild. At night, Jack sometimes dreamed of Whisper, of golden eyes watching from the edge of the woods, of the soft thud of paws in fresh snow, of the moment wildness itself had chosen to stand guard at his door. In the dreams, Whisper was never captive, never caged. He ran free, his fur silvered by moonlight, always just out of reach. As the winter deepened, Jack learned to live with the ache of absence. He poured himself into the invention, working late into the night, driven by the hope that the drones would one day save lives in faraway places. He told himself this was what Thomas would have wanted, what Whisper might approve of, a legacy built not on winning or losing, but on the courage to do the right thing, no matter the cost. When spring finally thawed the edges of the world, Emily stood at the tree line one last time, searching for movement in the shadows. She whispered goodbye to the woods and to the bobcat she loved, knowing that some gifts, like wild loyalty and hard-won trust, could never be kept, only cherished. They had won their battle, but not without sacrifice. The cost lingered in every empty dawn and every memory of golden eyes watching from the dark. The farm, at last, was theirs. But the wild heart that had once protected them had faded back into the silence, leaving them changed and grateful and just a little bit lonely. As the thaw of spring crept across the high meadows of Bend, Oregon, a new sense of order began to shape the days on the Hayes farm. Morning sunlight poured golden through clean windows, glinting off the workbench where Jack assembled parts for the drone, each tiny rotor blade and circuit board a piece of Thomas Hayes's old dream. The farmhouse, once cold and crumbling, now hummed with quiet purpose. It was no longer a sanctuary from the world's cruelty, but a place transformed by it, a haven built through struggle, loss, and the unyielding will to start again. The transition was subtle at first. Neighbors who had kept their distance now dropped by, not with suspicion, but with pie or tools or offers to lend a hand. Word had spread about Jack's court victory, about his plans for the humanitarian drones, about the way he and Emily had stood up to Arthur Vance and come out the other side. Some folks were drawn by curiosity, others by the simple desire to see if an old farm could really become a symbol of hope and resilience. Jack welcomed their help. He invited old ranchers to share stories about the land, young mechanics from the vocational school to learn about the drone's inner workings, and even Mrs. Lawson from next door, who brought seeds for the garden and memories of the Hayes family's better days. He never spoke much about the battle they'd fought. Those chapters were private, inscribed in scars and sleepless nights. But he let people see the results. A barn reborn as a workshop, a field cleared for test flights, a kitchen that smelled of baking bread and soldering iron. Emily began to come back to herself, bit by bit. The sharp edge of her loss dulled by the rituals of the new normal. She made friends at school, quiet but loyal. Her stories of Whisper slowly becoming legend among her classmates. half-believed tales of a wild guardian who watched over her family through their darkest nights. She spent long afternoons in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, her laughter sometimes echoing out to the tree line where the forest pressed close. For Jack, the work on the drones became more than a task. It was a calling. Each prototype felt like an offering to both his great-grandfather's memory and the wild spirit that had once kept them safe. The machines grew more sophisticated with every week, their tiny engines humming, their cameras sharp. He started taking calls from aid organizations and small clinics in remote mountain towns, people desperate for solutions that didn't involve dangerous roads or helicopters they could never afford. The farm, once nearly lost to memory and neglect, began to pulse with purpose. But it was more than just technology and invention that defined this new chapter. Jack had come to understand something fundamental about trust and wildness, about how the boundaries between the two are never as clear as they seem. He thought often of Whisper, how the Bobcat had never belonged to them, not really, but had chosen for a time to protect and walk beside them. The lesson settled deep. Real trust comes not from ownership or control, but from the courage to accept what cannot be tamed, to cherish the bond even as you let it go. On one gentle evening, Jack stood at the edge of the property, watching as the sun slipped behind the distant ridges, painting the sky in bands of orange and violet. Emily joined him, her hair wind-blown, her hands muddy from planting carrots. Together, they listened to the soft noises of the farm, the hum of a drone circling above, the chorus of spring peepers by the pond, the distant trill of a woodpecker. Jack remembered how, months earlier, he had feared this land, feared the wild that crept up to the doorstep, feared the ghosts of his own failures. Now, he saw the same fields through different eyes, as a place where struggle had become strength, where loss had become possibility, and where letting go had opened the door to something lasting and true. He caught Emily's gaze, saw in her face a reflection of all they had survived, and knew she understood too. The woods would always be wild, the future uncertain, but what they had built here, rooted in trust, in memory, in respect for everything that could not be claimed, would endure. Some nights, when the wind was right, Jack swore he could hear a distant rustle in the brush, see a glimmer of golden eyes between the trees. He would smile, not with longing, but with gratitude. Whisper was gone, but the wildness he represented had left its mark, shaping their lives and reminding them always to respect the freedom that makes true bonds possible. The farm had found its purpose. The Hayes legacy, nearly lost, was alive in every drone that lifted off into the dawn, in every act of kindness given and received, in the quiet courage to choose trust over fear. Jack knew now that some things must remain untamed, and that in letting go, they had truly found their place in the world. Sunset came slow and golden to the Hayes farm that summer, spilling light across the fields and painting the barn's new paint a warm, honeyed red. The air was thick with the scents of wild grass and cedar, the drone of insects, and the gentle hum of the machines Jack and Emily had helped bring to life. Each evening now felt like a quiet celebration, the end of another honest day's work, a chapter closed on old fears. Jack often found himself on the porch at this hour, arms folded, gaze sweeping across the land that had cost so much and given even more. He had started a ritual of quiet gratitude, naming in his mind every person and every moment that had helped bring them here. The pain of old battles hadn't vanished, but with each passing day, it faded, replaced by the grounding certainty of purpose. The farm was now more than a refuge. It had become a beacon for others, a place where neighbors gathered for coffee and advice, where travelers and dreamers came hoping to learn or help, where the legacy of Thomas Hayes was alive not only in blueprints, but in living, breathing community. Emily, too, had found her peace. She had grown taller and stronger, her steps more confident. In the garden, she taught the younger children how to coax beans up the fence posts, her voice patient, her laughter quick to bubble up. When the humanitarian drones flew their missions, delivering supplies over snowy mountain passes or into wildfire zones, Emily watched them climb into the sky, a spark of pride always in her eyes. She was still a child, but she'd become something else too. A witness, a storyteller, a living bridge between the wild and the world that had once been so dangerous. But the forest edge remained a place of mystery, a boundary never fully crossed. Most evenings, as dusk fell and the frogs began their song, Emily would wander to the very edge of the yard and gaze out into the shadows beneath the towering firs. Sometimes she'd sit quietly, knees drawn to her chest, listening to the sounds of night. She never called out, never tried to lure whisper back. Some bonds, she'd learned, were strongest when left unbroken by need or longing. Instead, she simply waited, heart open, sure that the wild was always watching, even if only from a distance. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the wind carried the scent of rain, Jack joined her at the tree line. He laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, and together they watched the forest shift with the coming night. The feeling was not one of loss, but of completion. They had honored what was wild, protected what could not be possessed, and in return found a kind of freedom neither of them had known before. Inside, the farm bustled with the new normal. People from town gathered in the big kitchen, sharing food and stories, celebrating the latest success of the drones, or simply relishing a rare, quiet moment of peace. Jack learned to listen as much as to speak, to offer help where he could, but also to let go, to trust that others would carry the work forward in their own way. As word spread about the Hayes farm, letters began to arrive. Some were from people in Bend, others from far-off places, all sharing stories of unlikely bonds, of wild animals who had protected or changed, or simply watched over them in times of need. Jack and Emily read every word together, marveling at the ways life could twist and surprise, at the courage it took to let go, and the even greater courage it took to tell the world what you had lost and found. On the anniversary of the court victory, the whole community gathered under strings of lanterns in the yard. There were speeches and laughter, the smell of roasting corn, and the steady drum of feet as children chased each other beneath the big trees. In a quiet moment, as the sky blushed with the last of the sun, Emily stood at the edge of the crowd, looking out at the forest. She felt the gaze of something vast and patient upon her, a silent promise that the wild would always be near, so long as she remembered to honor it. Jack joined her then, and together they watched the horizon, hearts full. He whispered what he'd learned, that some bonds only exist when you're brave enough to let go, and that the wildest forms of love and loyalty cannot be forced or contained. Emily nodded, understanding deep in her bones. As the stars blinked into being above the silent pines, the Hayes farm stood as living proof that struggle can become sanctuary, that the greatest gifts are those we set free. The golden eyes that once haunted their nights had become a legend, a reminder to all who passed through. Respect what is wild, and you'll find yourself protected in ways you can't predict. And so, as the night wrapped the farm in quiet, Emily sent a wish into the woods. a silent thank you to whisper, and to every wild thing that ever chose to love from afar. Have you ever met someone or something that changed your life but you had to let them go? Share your story in the comments. We'll read every word.